to the Relate Church podcast.
Therefore, Jesus no longer moved about publicly among the people of Judea. Instead, he withdrew to a region near the wilderness, to a village called Ephraim, where he stayed with his disciples. When it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, many went up from the country to Jerusalem for the ceremonial cleansing before the Passover. They kept looking for Jesus, and as they stood in the temple courts, they asked one another, "What do you think? Isn't he coming to the festival at all?" But the chief priests and the Pharisees had given orders that anyone who found out where Jesus was should report it so that they might arrest him. So what's going on here? It seems kind of confusing at first read, if I'm being honest. And that's part of the reason I picked this passage, because I love a good challenge. And honestly, I read this and I'm like, I think I need to do a lot of research if I'm going to understand anything happening here. And so part of what I want to talk about today, and you're going to have to forgive me because it'll get a little educational in here for a bit, but hopefully we can bring it back, make it nice and practical. And I encourage you to think of it more as backstory. So we all love a good backstory. We might not all like learning and college and school, but just imagine for a sec you're watching Lord of the Rings and you just pop in at the moment where Frodo's throwing that ring into Mount Doom. Like, you're going to be quite confused. You're going to kind of show up there and you'll be like, that was a nice piece of jewelry. And it kind of let me do really cool stuff. Like, I could have been invisible. That's kind of neat. And you're like, why is he destroying this? And so if you haven't read the first part of the books, you're not going to know what's going on there. So we're going to take you through the first part of the books here to kind of bring this all together so we know what John is talking about when he is talking about resurrection here. And what we're going to look at is not so much on a personal level. There is a personal aspect of resurrection, and I think that was captured beautifully last week by Angela. But there's also a more corporate, what I would like to call a national resurrection that is the expectation of the day. There's just common beliefs, common presuppositions about what Jesus is going to do when he shows up. And so I want to take you through that, just looking at Israel's history in three big stages. Your first one, you've got Egypt and the Exodus. I think most of us in here are going to be familiar with that story, but Israel was slaves in the land of Egypt, and God brought them out. He delivered them, performing miraculous signs, and he brought them into a promised land and settled them as their own nation. Now, that's a very condensed version, but that hope is important. God has saved them, he's brought them out, and they want him to do it again in this case. Now, the second event happens in 720 BC. There's an invasion by the Assyrians. Now, Israel at this point had split into two nations. You have the northern kingdom and you have the southern kingdom of Judah. Well, in this event, the northern kingdom of Israel gets taken over by the Assyrians and taken into exile. So I guess in practical terms, this looks like half of the nation is just kind of gone and they don't know what to do with it, how to make sense of it. And so this is what some of the prophets, namely Isaiah, talks about this event. And he looks at the problem lying behind it and envisions it as actually having to do with the heart of Israel at the time being one of idolatry, one of turning away from God. And so God's protection was not with them in this moment as the Assyrians came. Because we don't know if God wanted to protect Israel against the Assyrians. If that was his ultimate end goal, it would have happened because God can do that. And then the next event is similar, also stemming from a place of Israel forsaking the promises they've made with God and turning to the gods of the other nations. And in this event, the Babylonians are coming against the southern part of the kingdom, Judah. And so you've got this whole kind of mess of political anxiety going on about how do we handle this situation and what's going on here, which is probably quite relatable to some of the circumstances we face today. We look out and we're kind of asking questions about what's going on and how do we make sense of it. And what Israel does here and what Judah does is they look to a few key symbols that are kind of become pinnacles for what's going to be happening and how God's going to bring his presence back to the city. And so the first one I want to talk about is that the temple was destroyed in the second invasion. And the temple, just to summarize, is essentially referring to the presence of God is in the temple. This is where the people go, they meet with God there. And so to have that destroyed, it's raising questions of where is God? The second thing that Judah and Israel lost is that they lost their nation. They lost the land, which is quite necessary to become a nation. You need some land. You also need a king. You need someone to rule and govern this nation. And the third thing that happens in this event is that the kingdoms are scattered. You've got the northern kingdom scattered. You've got the southern kingdom scattered. They're all over the place. And some of the expectations we see in the passage in John is simply talking about how God is, his big plan and that expectation is to bring these kingdoms back together. And then the final thing is that there's an idea of oneness. Now, this oneness isn't just coming together as one nation. It's coming together as one nation with a heart in devotion to God. And this is often talked about in terms of a new covenant. The new covenant isn't just simply a new agreement. It's actually everyone coming together and realigning themselves with God's plan. Wow. So we need to understand these things, I think, to really get a full picture of what's going on here. And the reason I call this event a national resurrection is because the events of the exile were often envisioned as a death of Israel. Everything that kind of held them together, made them who they are, and formed their identity was stripped and taken away, and they were left asking what happened. So you can look at Ezekiel 37 is actually a very common passage. A lot of people are familiar with the dry bones and that imagery. Well, part of what that's doing, well, just read it through and then I'll discuss it here. Then he said to me, "Son of man, these bones are the people of Israel. They say, our bones are dried up and our hope is gone. We are cut off. Therefore, prophesy and say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says. My people, I'm going to open your graves and bring you up from them. I will bring you back to the land of Israel. Then you, my people, will know that I am the Lord when I open your graves and bring you up from them. I will put my spirit in you, and you will live, and I will settle you in your own land. Then you will know that I, the Lord, have spoken, and I have done it, declares the Lord." And so the solution we see to this problem of national death is one of national resurrection. Now, I do have a diagram. I don't know if we can get that up on screen right away. But in this diagram, I kind of outline the solution that is there. And that solution, in the expectation of the people, is their expectation of how God is going to fulfill his promise of restoring Israel is that a Messiah would come and that this Messiah would destroy the oppressor, that he would do again what God did at the Exodus and deliver the people and restore a nation in the land. And that is the idea of resurrection and restoration that they're expecting. This restoration will bring life, and God's glory will be revealed when his people are once again positioned where they were in their glory days when God was at the center of their community. And so this brings us now to the actual raising of Lazarus. We often want to think that what they're responding to when they see the raising of Lazarus, what the people are maybe agreeing with and believing or disagreeing with and not believing, we like to think that maybe, no one gets raised from the dead. Like, that's just something that doesn't happen. But in those days, that did happen. That's not really the focus of what's going on. There are passages in the Old Testament, in 1 Kings, and 2 Kings, where Elijah and Elisha both resurrect people from the dead. So the community knows that people can be raised from the dead, and that a powerful prophet could do this. And so really, part of what they're trying to accomplish here, or part of what this passage is trying to get at, is who is Jesus? Is he the Messiah that's not just going to raise someone from the dead, but is he the Messiah who's going to come and fix the problem? Is he really the solution? Is he really the one who has the power to bring resurrection and life? Is he really the one who can heal our community, make us whole again, and make sure that God's purposes are carried out in the world? Wow. And so, looking at that, I think it's easy to kind of understand then why maybe some people might be hesitant to believe him. Because you've got the Roman government, it's kind of breathing down your neck, and they've seen other messianic figures come, and every time it happens, it doesn't pan out, and you got the pressure of Rome coming right at you, trying to stop you, trying to make sure that you're not moving forward, making sure that this uprising gets quelled as soon as possible. And so, yeah, that brings us to the first part of the passage. We've got kind of people who make a decision to believe and those who don't believe. And I want to just look at 4 responses here to the work of Jesus and his claim to be not just the Son of God, but the Messiah is what's really at play here. Is he the right figure? Is this the guy we've been waiting for? So, response number 1 is that of the Sanhedrin. I'll maybe just read the passage, a little brief snippet here again, so that we can come back and kind of reflect on what we've seen earlier out of context. So the chief priests and the Pharisees called a meeting of the council and said, "What are we to do? This man is performing many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and destroy both our holy place, that is the temple, and our nation, take away our land." But one of them, Caiaphas, who is the high priest that year, said to them, "You know nothing at all. You do not understand that it is better for you to have one man die for the people than to have the whole nation destroyed." And now, their key fear here is obviously the destruction of the nation. They want the safety of their people. This group is in charge of making sure that this people group stays safe. So there's a lot of pressure on them, and in some ways you can really understand why they would be reluctant to go and affirm his ministry right away. Because if we get this wrong, this is the end of your nation. Like, it's life or death here. And so the path they take is one that to them looks like life, but the end looks like death. And that's really the irony that's captured in this passage, is that they have misunderstood what Jesus has come to do. And in an attempt to stop this from outworking itself, stop this plan from coming to fruition, they set up a plan to bring healing that doesn't work out. And not only that, but there's also the irony that, Caiaphas, if I'm honest, he doesn't really seem to be saying anything new that the people hadn't been saying. Like, they were kind of leading to this, and he just kind of puts a final brick on the top and says, "Oh, this is the plan here. We got to make sure he's offed." But in the meantime, God's really at work, and we have a nice little narrative comment afterwards helping us out, reflecting on this moment and showing how, no, this was God's plan all along. Caiaphas doesn't know that Jesus is going to resurrect from the dead. That's news to him. He would have no idea. But the author of John does. And the author of John helps us see in this event that God is sovereign throughout. Even what the Sanhedrin planned for evil and to stop the plans of God, they couldn't thwart what God was about to do. They could not undermine God's plan. And what this passage does is set up instead what God's plan really is. And so we're gonna move on now to the next group. which is the skeptical, the crowd of unbelievers who they didn't believe in Jesus, but they were also not part of this group that planned on killing him. They just probably shared a lot of the same concerns as that group, but they weren't as invested in the outcome. They wanted to make sure that the people who should know about this kind of do know about this. And that's all I'm going to say about them. The third group is those who believe but don't fully understand. Now, the interesting thing here is that the plan that is outlaid in this passage, when Caiaphas says, "You know nothing at all," it's actually raising a question not just for that group of people, not just for the Sanhedrin, but for the readers of John as well. Because in reality, we see that they actually, the disciples and the crowd who believed, they were also missing the point of Jesus, who Jesus was. They were expecting this messianic figure to show up in the same way that these expectations were kind of formed and given to them by the culture around them. And so just one example, I could look at a few, but for the sake of time, we'll look at John 12:13-18. Just after this passage, just after this response, we've got the triumphal entry of Jesus into the city. And in this moment, we kind of get some insight into the attitudes of those who believe. So the next day, the great crowd that had come to the festival heard that Jesus was coming to Jerusalem. So they took branches of palm trees and went out to meet him, shouting, "Hosanna! Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord, the King of Israel." Jesus found a young donkey and sat on it. And as it is written, "Do not be afraid, daughter of Zion. Look, your king is coming, sitting on a donkey's colt." His disciples did not understand these things at first. But when Jesus was glorified, then they remembered that these things had been written of him and had been done to him. Okay, we'll just leave it there. I think we should hopefully get the point that they're not fully understanding who Jesus was, but they believe that he's a Messiah. They believe that he's an important figure. And it's not until after the resurrection, when they see Jesus rise again, that they start to connect the dots and see that, oh no, there's something more going on here that we haven't fully understand. And so this brings us to, I guess we can mention first the fourth category is those who believe and understand, but that's just, at this point, the narrator and the ideal reader. And so the question really raised by this passage, and I know it's late for a title, but if you want a title, it's, do you understand? Because that's a question we're being asked. And I think there's all kinds of things that can get in the way of our actually understanding, actually seeing Jesus for who he is and not who we expect him to be based on our cultural understandings. And that's part of what John's community is actually working to, what John's trying to outwork in his community. He's speaking to a community of believers and asking them whether they've recognized who this Messiah is. They recognize that this event of the raising of Lazarus actually foreshadows the resurrection of Christ and the responses that people will have. They're seeing the parallel between Christ's resurrection and Lazarus' resurrection. So that's kind of why they're asking, hey, we saw how people responded here. How do we respond here when we see Christ? But the community themselves hadn't actually seen Christ get resurrected, but they did have a testimony from those who did. And what John is partly trying to make clear here is that this testimony actually counts for just as much as seeing it. Because, maybe in seeing the event, they started to connect the dots, but now, give it some time, when some reflection, guided by the Holy Spirit, they've actually outworked how these dots are all connected, and they have a more full image now than the disciples had at first. So that's kind of what's going on in this community, and there's shifting the concerns from a national level of resurrection. It's no longer for John's community about whether Israel's going to be resurrected, It's now actually about cosmic resurrection. Is Jesus the Messiah who's going to come into the world and actually deal with the world's problems? Now, this is where we come in, because I think we're a lot like John's community. We're here, we're not so much concerned, like, we might have some concerns politically about what happens to Israel, but at the end of the day, we're asking, how is God working in our lives? Is he the Messiah? Is he the one who's going to actually show up and bring healing, bring wholeness, bring health, and bring resurrection to the world around us? And I want to suggest that we have a lot of expectations of God too. You can maybe call messianic hopes that are very paralleled with what was going on then. And the question we need to ask ourselves really is, what are those problems that we expect God to come into the world and fix? And how do we expect God to fix them? Do we believe that Jesus is the Messiah? Do we believe that he is the answer to the problem? And so now I've got another diagram here that I want to pull up, which is hopefully going to help connect how this shift happens in John's gospel. We've got, it'll be the next one. Yeah, this one. Okay, so now we've got a hope for cosmic resurrection. And the sign that we've got is the testimony of Jesus' resurrection. So we've got this promise, we've got this new expectation that he sets up. And that new expectation is that the truth of how God fulfilled scriptures is that the Messiah would come and destroy the power of evil through self-sacrificial love. Now this is new. This isn't in the old diagram, if you noticed. So that's a central point right there. And this Messiah would bring life, which is the resurrection, to the whole of creation. And God's glory would be revealed in Jesus, who is now enthroned as the new king. And so this is the new framework that we're working on. And I just want to, in the last couple of minutes, try to highlight this in what I found to be a bit of a helpful analogy of two trees. So just for a second, imagine that there's this big, beautiful garden. And in this garden, there's a massive, tall tree that eventually, over time, develops a sickness and it starts to die. But slowly, and it's not actually ever going to fade out. The sickness is more killing the fruit of the tree than it is the tree itself. And so, over time, the fruit becomes bitter, it becomes gross, you don't want to eat it. And not only that, this disease has also affected the soil in the garden. And suddenly, you notice there's nothing else growing in this garden. It's just this one big tree at the center, and it does not look healthy. It does not look good. Now, the expectation that everyone has is that the gardener is going to come. He's going to show up. He's going to do things to the tree, whatever a tree thinks. I'm not a gardener, so I can't really tell you. But he's going to do things to this tree, and this tree is going to be restored to what it was. It's going to look beautiful again. It's going to be healthy. It's going to help bring fruit to the garden. Things are going to start growing again. But imagine the disappointment now when that gardener shows up and doesn't do this. Instead, the gardener takes a seed from that tree, plants it in the soil in a different part of the garden, and at the same time, he kills the roots of that old tree. Now, something I did look up and do know about gardening is that if you kill the roots of a tree, it can take up to 10 years for that tree to show signs that it's dying. It's kind of fascinating in the sense that we see this big problem, and the roots of it are dead, but really, this tree still looks healthy and flourishing. And meanwhile, God's planted this new seed over here. And this seed, it's just a little guy. It's starting to grow, starting to spring up. And there might not be lots of fruit on it yet. And compared to this massive tree over here, it doesn't look like the solution to our problem. But this tree's growing. This tree's getting bigger. There's signs of life in the garden. There's little patches of flowers. There's little blades of grass shooting up. animals are coming back. Meanwhile, this tree, we're waiting for it to die out. It's only a matter of time. God's already set the plan in motion. God came not to deal with the consequences, not to deal with the little external visible signs that we see. He came to deal with the root of the problem. And that is not always seen. And that is why I think, in my mind, faith can be so hard sometimes, because you just have to open up your news channel for even a split second these days, and you see war, disease, sickness, brokenness, and it can be hard to hold on to faith sometimes, because it looks like this old tree is alive and well and stronger than it's ever been. And it takes a lot of courage, it takes a lot of faith to step back and actually look at how God has said that he's going to deal with this problem. And that is to destroy the root of the problem, to take out the problem permanently. And what we're seeing when we look out at the world and see all these troubles and challenges is just that old tree fading away. It's there temporarily, but as soon this new tree is going to show up, it's going to be in full strength. We're going to have the new kingdom at full power, and that right there is the understanding of what Jesus has come to do. That's what John is trying to get at in this moment. And so, in the last couple of minutes here, I just want to kind of consider some of our responses to the resurrection. And yeah, just ask, if you're honest with yourself, what do you think about the resurrection? Do you think Jesus is the Messiah who has come to fix the problem? Or do you think the problems are still alive and active in the world at full strength, the way they've always been? Because if that's the case, then nothing has changed, and Jesus was not the Messiah. But if Jesus was who he claims to be, and who the Gospel of John says he is, then those problems, they're on the way out. And what God's doing now is actually a new thing. It's a new community, a new kingdom, and that is growing up in this little shoot that we might call the church. The church has just attached itself to this new shoot that itself is connected to the source of life, which is God. And so the answer isn't just to look out and try and solve all of the world's problems, as can be thought. I mean, I guess in most people's minds, we've got to just fix what's out there. But what Jesus calls us to do is turn inwards, to connect again to the source, and to embrace this new community, embrace this new way of life, this new way of healing and wholeness. And so as we look at the responses, we can pull up the same responses that we had earlier. There are those who are actively hostile towards this message of new hope, because they don't see it as a solution. They're just looking at all the way over on this big tree, they're focused on the problems. And anything that this new tree does, if anything, it's just getting in the way and taking up needed nutrients from the soil. And the culmination of this actively hostile group is actually that they would go so far as to bring about death. Even in their attempts to restore and bring life, they're willing to kill for it, because this tree is a threat. And then we've got these people kind of in this passive unbelief stage, which maybe you're not quite as invested into this whole thing. You're like, yeah, maybe this tree's good, maybe this tree's good. We're kind of in the middle. And really, we're just going to take whatever's kind of working out at the moment. We're just going to go with whatever culture is doing. Whatever the experts tell us, that's probably right. And we don't want to put too much hope in this little guy. But then we've also got, and I think this is going to be a lot of us in here, that we've got people who believe but don't fully understand. And I say this honestly, having reflected over the last few years, that this is an easy place to find yourself, even if you've been a Christian for many years. Because this little guy, it's growing slow, and sometimes the temptation is to be like, oh, that's a big tree over there. Maybe we got to do something about that tree. Let's stop that tree from growing. And slowly our focus shifts from this little plant back to this big plant. We still believe, we still think, yeah, eventually this tree is going to be huge, I'll be right on board when that happens. But right now, we got to deal with that first. And our attention starts to shift, and we find ourselves, yes, I believe, but maybe I don't fully understand. Like, surely God's doing something more here. And my solution to that is that we can recognize that God's at work in ways that are unseen, and that his plan has already been carried out and fulfilled. And that brings us to the final group, who believe and understand. Now, this group is all in for this little shoot. They're all in for this little tree. There's nothing going to hold them back, because they know that that tree's already dead. The roots are gone, root system's done, whatever. What we're seeing, it's maybe a problem, but it's going to be gone. And once this tree's big, it's going to make up for anything that we've seen here. And so this new tree, this new community of believers who understand and believe, is God's new ultimate plan for the earth and how he's going to deal with this problem. And that is connecting us back to the source, back to the heart of who Jesus is, restoring what we lost with the temple, which was the presence of God, restoring what we lost in the land, because now the whole earth belongs to God, and Jesus is the king. And it pulls together all of the community that was lost, because honestly, we've all turned back to God. That's the plan. But there's a new covenant. There's a new oneness with God, that creation has turned itself back to the Creator. And that is the solution to the problem. And so I want to just leave you with that question. If there's nothing else you get from this message, I just want you to ask yourself, do you believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God? And do you believe that he has not only come to fix the problem, but actually accomplished it? Yeah. And so I just want to, if you're in here and you've been on the fence maybe about where you stand with God, whether you do believe or don't believe, then I want to give you an opportunity to make a decision right now that will, I think, ultimately change the rest of your life. If you're here and you've been looking at this big tree for a long time and seeing a lot of problems and hoping maybe that little tree starts growing a bit faster because nothing we're doing over here seems to be working, if you want to make a decision today to turn towards that little tree, then I want to pray for you. And honestly, it doesn't begin with knowing how everything's going to work out and understanding fully. But what it does begin with is believing. Yeah. Believing comes first, then we can work on the understanding. And so if you're in here and feeling that way, then with every head bowed and eyes closed, I just invite you to pray this prayer with me. Lord Jesus Christ, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God. I believe that you have come into this earth to fix the problem of evil, that you have brought a new path to healing and life. And today, Lord Jesus, I make a decision to follow you with my whole heart for the rest of my life. Amen.
Thanks for listening to this week's message. If something stood out to you, if you'd like to submit a prayer request, or if you'd like to learn more about how you can get connected, email relate@relatechurch.ca. If you'd like to partner with us and our community initiatives, please visit relatechurch.ca/give. It's been an honor to spend this time with you. Catch you next week.